The HOA president pointed at me, eyes smug, voice ice cold. "That'll be $300,000 in retroactive fees," he said, loud enough for my new neighbors to hear. "You've been enjoying our amenities tax-free." I blinked once, twice, then smiled. Because while this man thought he was shaking down a clueless heir, he didn't realize what he'd just done. He had made a false financial claim publicly against a federal lawyer on federal land jurisdiction. And I don't just play with lawsuits. I build them, brick by brick, witness by witness, statute by statute. So, tell me, how many HOA presidents survive a court case where the judge used to clerk under me? When my grandfather passed away, I expected a modest legacy, maybe an antique watch, some old law books, or a collection of half-dead bonsais from his porch. What I did not expect was the letter from his attorney telling me I had inherited a 30-room mansion in a place called Falcon Ridge, a place so exclusive that GPS services stuttered halfway up the hill. The mansion sat on 5 acres of elevated ground overlooking the rest of the gated community like a sleeping giant. When I first arrived, I parked my car in the winding, tree-lined driveway and just stared. Ivy curled up the marble columns like green fire. 2 stone lions flanked the main steps, weathered by decades of wind but still proud. It looked like something out of a noir film, and I could practically hear the ghosts of litigation past whispering through the cracks in the facade. Inside, everything was preserved. My grandfather, Judge Franklin Monroe, hadn't just left behind an estate, he left behind an archive. Sealed documents, bound ledgers, tape recordings, and on the mantel a bronze plaque with a quote I never forgot: "Never let the mob mistake your silence for surrender." I should have known then that I'd be needing those words. The welcome committee came within 48 hours. He was 6'4", bald with a pencil mustache and wraparound sunglasses, standing on my porch with 2 other men in pressed polos. Clipboard in hand, arrogance in his spine, and a smirk that made me itch for cross-examination. "You must be the heir," he said, like he was reading a crime report. "I'm Edward Brackley, president of the Falcon Ridge Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your unpaid HOA dues." I blinked. "Unpaid? $300 for 97.43 to be exact," he said without hesitation. "Retroactive. Accumulated over the last 21 years. Interest, penalties, compounded fines." I blinked again, this time slower. "My grandfather never joined the HOA," I replied. "This property isn't under your authority." Edward chuckled, that oily, nasal laugh of someone who thinks bureaucracy is divine. "I'm afraid the bylaws have changed since his time. There's a provision, Section 8B, that annexed all non-member properties within Falcon Ridge into the HOA in 2005. The board approved it." I narrowed my eyes. "You can't unilaterally annex private property into a corporate covenant." His smile stretched. "Actually, we can. And we did. If you'd like, you can appeal the decision with the Falcon Ridge Arbitration Panel. But you'll need to pay a $10,000 filing fee. Also, your mailbox is non-compliant. That's another $250 fine." I stared at him, feeling something cold slide down my spine. Not fear. The kind of chill I get before an opening argument. The kind that says get your facts, get your law, and get ready to go for the throat. "I'll have to look into that," I said calmly. "Sure," he said, tapping his clipboard. "But be advised, any delay in payment accrues at $200 per day. And failure to comply with Falcon Ridge community standards may result in a lien being placed on the property. We'd hate to start legal proceedings. This neighborhood thrives on cooperation." I closed the door without a word. Then I called the county clerk's office. An hour later, I had 3 documents in hand: the original zoning map from 1979, the land use permit from 1981, and a federal easement filed in 1993 that declared the Monroe estate a protected parcel due to its historical architecture and prior litigation involving land rights. In plain English, the HOA had no jurisdiction here. My grandfather hadn't just opted out of the HOA, he'd carved a legal moat around this property so deep even the IRS would need a ladder. Still, something didn't sit right. That $300,000 number wasn't random. It was strategic. It was a scare tactic meant to force a sale or extract submission. So I dug deeper. The following morning, I visited the county assessor's office under the guise of updating the inheritance records. The clerk, a helpful woman named Melissa, pulled up the digital archive. When I asked about Falcon Ridge's 2005 annexation of non-member lots, she frowned. That was never approved by the county board. They tried to pass something through a community development hearing, but it failed. We have the denial record on file. Want a copy? I nodded. 10 minutes later, I held the proof. The HOA had made a claim based on a policy that never passed legal review. They were bluffing. And bluffing badly. I walked back to the mansion, my mind already running at 90 miles per hour. In the foyer, I stood beneath the massive oil painting of my grandfather in his judicial robes and muttered, "You really left me a war, didn't you?" He had. Because as I began digging through the study, a mahogany cathedral of law books and aged whiskey, I found evidence that this wasn't the first time Falcon Ridge tried to claim the Monroe estate. Letters from past HOA boards. Cease and desist replies typed on federal letterhead. One binder labeled Harassment Attempts 2003 to 2011. My grandfather had documented everything. He'd beaten them in court once. But now with him gone, they thought they could try again. That night, my mailbox was stuffed with envelopes. HOA citations. One said I needed to remove the unauthorized eagle crest from my wrought iron gate. Another said the curtains in the front window were not earth-toned. A third accused me of inappropriate tree spacing. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was stupid. And stupidity is always the first crack in any enemy's armor. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the property. Every fence post. Every shrub. Every camera. Yes, camera. My grandfather had installed a full surveillance system with tapes going back over a decade. I spent hours reviewing footage, and what I found made my skin crawl. HOA officials had trespassed more than once. Photos. Notes. A man in a Falcon Ridge security windbreaker attempting to open the rear gate with bolt cutters 3 months before my grandfather died. This wasn't just a debt dispute. This was a campaign. A hostile takeover. They wanted the mansion. The land. The elevated view. The control. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the dining room table with stacks of records, scanned documents, legal pads full of annotations, and my grandfather's voice in my head. They only win if you play their game by their rules. So change the game. I made my plan. Not revenge. Not yet. First, I would play the part of the confused, polite heir. I'd collect every lie they told, every paper they served, every recording, every dollar they tried to squeeze. And then I'd burn the entire operation down, starting with the very man who thought he could put a price tag on my family's legacy. Because I wasn't just an heir. I was a federal lawyer. And I was about to turn Falcon Ridge into a case study in racketeering and civil rights violations. They just didn't know it yet. 2 days after Edward Brackley tried to slap me with a 6-figure bill for breathing on my own property, I started receiving daily visits from his HOA compliance officers. These weren't neighbors with clipboards, no. These were uniformed men with tactical boots and cheap radios walking my perimeter like mall cops who'd been handed a false badge and a vendetta. One even knocked on my door at 6:14 a.m. on a Saturday, citing a violation for having non-regulation gravel in the driveway. "It's granite," I said flatly, holding my coffee. From the original quarry listed in the 1981 landmark registration. He stared at me like I'd spoken in Sanskrit, then scribbled something on his pad. "Still needs to be neutral tone per section 1(2.7.3) of the community aesthetic mandate." Then came the parking tickets. For my own driveway. I'd find bright yellow citations tucked under my windshield wiper that read, "Unauthorized vehicle on private drive pending HOA review." My name was typed in bold at the top. Not handwritten. Typed. They'd entered me into their system without consent. Each notice demanded payment within 72 hours to avoid escalation. They even cited a clause about guest limitations, claiming I had exceeded the allowable number of visitors for a non-dues-paying member. My guests were my law clerks. One of them was pregnant. The HOA sent a notice about nuisance activities accompanied by a blurry photo of her stepping out of her car. That was the first time I felt real rage. That cold, clinical kind of rage that builds silently in the back of your skull, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers, "Take your time. Burn it clean." I started building a case. I documented every visit, every fine, every interaction. I bought 3 trail cams and mounted them in the hedges angled low so they could catch the tags on their white SUVs. I began logging timestamps and badge numbers. I pulled security cam footage and created digital backups stored on encrypted drives. The harassment was methodical. But I was more methodical. I reached out to an old friend, Rachel, a zoning and land use specialist who owed me a favor after I'd helped her get her nephew out of a bad criminal case involving a rigged code enforcement sting. She came down from DC, stayed 2 nights in the guest wing, and by Monday morning she had a full environmental overlay analysis and a digital survey of the property. Your land sits on an independent parcel exempt from Falcon Ridge's special use overlay, she said, scanning through layers of zoning codes like a surgeon flipping MRI slides. They can't fine you. They can't impose mandates. This land was designated as sovereign under the Federal Architectural Preservation Act. They're trespassing every time they walk that driveway. She looked up, deadpan. Do you want to just sue them now, or are you playing the long game? The long game, I said. Let them hang themselves. Because I'd found something better than evidence. I'd found a pattern. The HOA wasn't just harassing me, they were doing this to others. Quietly. Discreetly. Systematically. I began knocking on doors. Politely. Calmly. The way only someone with a three-piece suit and courtroom-ready posture could. I asked questions. I listened. And I discovered the HOA had been using fraudulent liens, extorted fines, and fake bylaws to coerce dozens of elderly homeowners into selling at below market value. The properties were then acquired through a realty trust registered in Nevada, Falcon Ridge Holdings, LLC, whose signatory was none other than Thomas Brackley, Edward's son. I found deed transfers with forged signatures. Notaries who'd been suspended for rubber stamping blank documents. Families who had received anonymous threats in their mailboxes before sudden code violations began arriving weekly. One woman, 84-year-old Ruth Granger, had her oxygen delivery truck blocked by an HOA vehicle because her mailbox wasn't the approved height. They fined her $1,200. When she couldn't pay, they threatened to garnish her Social Security. She moved in with her daughter 3 weeks later, and her house was sold for $80,000 under market. My hands were shaking when I left Ruth's daughter's house. That wasn't just corruption. That was elder abuse. That was a federal crime. I went back to my grandfather's office that night and pulled the box labeled Zoning Armageddon. Inside were maps, affidavits, correspondences with state preservation officers, and a full recorded deposition he'd taken from a former HOA treasurer back in 2008. My grandfather hadn't just been resisting the HOA. He'd been preparing for a full-scale legal war. The files were color-coded, indexed, and cross-referenced. He'd written in the margins with that same steel-tipped pen he used to use in the courtroom. Trust no vote held without independent observers. Do not acknowledge lien until verified by title insurance. Brackley's sister works in records office. Monitor for document tampering. I stayed up all night reading. At 5:43 a.m. I drafted a 17-page brief outlining the constitutional violations of Falcon Ridge HOA under color of law, including trespass, harassment, coercion, and fraudulent lien filing. Then I picked up the phone and called Elliot. My personal attorney, ex-military, still had the kind of voice that made court clerks say yes sir even when he was wrong. You ready to make someone cry? I asked. I've been bored since February, he said. The plan was simple. First, we'd send a demand for cessation, legally worded but unmistakably a warning shot. Second, we'd file a public records request for every fine, citation, and lien issued by the HOA in the last 15 years. Third, we'd issue a notice of intent to file a federal injunction if harassment continued. And we'd make it public. But before I launched it, I wanted to test just how bold they were willing to be. So I baited them. I held a dinner party. Sent open invitations to 5 homeowners I knew had been bullied by the HOA. Invited a couple legal friends. Lit the front driveway with non-regulation LED lamps. Played jazz at slightly above the neighborhood's approved decibel level. And parked a non-resident vehicle, Rachel's cherry red Tesla, on the driveway overnight. The next morning, I counted 4 violation slips. All issued at 5:07 a.m. My surveillance footage showed 2 compliance officers walk up my steps, attempt to open the side gate, and then take photos of my garage. That was the final entry I needed. That night, Elliot filed our first cease and desist. And I sent an anonymous tip with attachments to the county DA, the zoning commission, and the state attorney general. Then I waited. And watched. The next day, Brackley came knocking again. This time in a navy blazer and khakis with a manila folder in his hand and a security guard flanking him. Mr. Monroe, I'm here to serve notice of lien initiation. We are formally placing your property under HOA review and initiating foreclosure proceedings if payment is not made within 14 days. I didn't say a word. Just held out my phone. Pressed play. The video showed 2 of his officers trespassing. One looking through my garage window. The other taking pictures of license plates. His face twitched. You've made a mistake, I said softly. You walked into the home of a federal lawyer with surveillance footage, zoning authority, legal exemption status, and a file cabinet of your past crimes. And now you've trespassed again, while delivering fraudulent financial documents. He blanched. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just leaned forward and smiled like my grandfather used to when he knew the other side had perjured themselves. This mansion isn't under your jurisdiction. This land is protected. And I'm about to make you the face of the biggest HOA scandal this county has ever seen. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. And for the first time I saw it. Doubt. Cracks in the armor. The subtle unraveling of a bully who just realized the kid in the room had brought a bigger stick. I closed the door, locked it, then went to my study to prepare Phase 3, bring the community into the storm. Because I wasn't just going to win my land back. I was going to break the HOA. From the inside out. The week after Brackley delivered his bluff of a lien, the HOA dropped all pretense of diplomacy. That Tuesday, I came home from court to find a freshly poured concrete barricade blocking the front gate to my driveway. No notice. No permit tag. Just a solid wall of cement waist-high with a laminated notice zip tied to it. Construction in progress, Community Beautification Project, Falcon Ridge HOA. The audacity. I parked at the bottom of the hill and walked up in my suit shoes, the soles scraping against gravel as I felt the heat of something darker settle in my bones. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was occupation. The next day, my water pressure dropped to a dribble. I called the utility department. They claimed there was unplanned maintenance on the line servicing my home, projected to last 3 weeks. I asked for documentation. They put me on hold for 22 minutes, then hung up. The day after that, my power flickered. When I stepped outside to investigate, I found 2 workers in unmarked uniforms splicing a junction box on the corner of my property. When I asked for ID, they bolted. I caught their plates. They were registered to a private contractor, Silverback Municipal Services, the same name that appeared in HOA annual budgets under infrastructure improvements. I filed a restraining order that night. Elliot filed a companion letter to the County Utility Oversight Board with 10 years of tampering violations from Silverback's parent company. The barricade was still there, though. So I called in an old favor from a federal marshal, Jake Mallory, a hammer of a man who once dismantled a cartel's logistics network using a pencil and a zoning map. Jake arrived with his boots still dusty from a drug seizure down in Texas. He looked at the barricade, spat in the dirt, and called the sheriff's office. Unauthorized construction. Violation of property access rights under Title 18. Tear it down or I'll file a motion so heavy it breaks your fax machine. The concrete was gone by sundown. But that wasn't the end. That was only the beginning of the escalation. 2 nights later, I woke to a siren wail echoing from my front gate. Flashing blue strobes, a mechanical voice blaring through a PA system, "You are in violation of community ordinance. Step outside for compliance confirmation." I looked through my bedroom window and saw 2 black SUVs idling outside the property, lights spinning like an IC raid. HOA patrol? Except Falcon Ridge HOA had no legal authority to detain, question, or intimidate. They were, at best, private citizens with security badges. At worst, they were thugs in khakis playing cop. I didn't step outside. I called Jake. By the time he arrived, they were gone. But I had the footage. Full facial ID. License plates. Date-stamped recordings from 2 angles. Jake watched the playback with his jaw clenched. "That's a felony," he said. "Unauthorized use of emergency signaling. Impersonation of law enforcement. Intimidation under color of law. We're going to bury these bastards." The next morning, the HOA newsletter went out. Not via email. Hand-delivered. 1 copy left on every porch in the subdivision, glossy and full color. On page 3, beneath a smiling stock photo of Edward Brackley, was a section titled "Security Warning. Rogue Resident Threatens Community Harmony." My name was printed in bold. New property owner of 237 Ridgeview has refused to cooperate with community regulations and is currently under investigation for hostile activity and improper land use. Residents are advised to report any unusual behavior and avoid engaging with the individual directly. It wasn't just slander. It was a call for mob rule. I didn't reply. I didn't publish a counterstatement. I simply compiled the newsletter into my evidence binder. But something changed after that. I started noticing unfamiliar faces walking past my windows, phones held out like they were recording. My mail began arriving torn. My garbage can went mysteriously missing for 3 days, then reappeared half-melted behind the shed. I'd find footprints in the mulch beds by the side windows. One morning, my law clerk Olivia arrived pale and shaking. Someone had tailed her from the community gate to my front steps, then parked across the street and watched the house for an hour. I called the local precinct. The dispatcher told me to call the HOA liaison. I laughed. I am the HOA's legal nightmare, I said, and hung up. That was the moment I realized the system in this town was compromised. Brackley had friends on the council. He had donors in the building inspection office. He had golf partners in the sheriff's department. If I wanted justice, I'd need to go federal. So I prepared the referral. I filed it with the U.S. Attorney's Office under 18 U.S.C. Section 241, Conspiracy Against Rights. I included affidavits from 5 homeowners who had been coerced into selling, plus 1 notarized statement from a former HOA compliance officer who admitted they were instructed to fabricate violations. But the federal machine moved slow. Meanwhile, the HOA kept grinding. The next hit came subtle, a claim filed with the county tax office disputing the Monroe Mansion's historical easement. If it was revoked, the HOA could argue renewed jurisdiction. The document was unsigned but filed under a shell corporation called Equity Initiative of Ridgeview. I traced the LLC to a P.O. box in Arlington, Virginia, but the payment for filing came from a Falcon Ridge HOA general fund account. I confronted the county official who claimed the review had already been opened. That's when I pulled out my badge. Not a real badge, of course, but my federal credentials. Court authorization as an amicus curiae advisor for state/federal land arbitration. The same credential I'd used in 3 cases that went before the Ninth Circuit. Suddenly, the tone changed. The easement review was paused for reassessment. I went home and added that to my war log. That night, I found someone had keyed my clerk's car. 4 long scratches across the door, forming the letters HOA. Olivia cried. I didn't. I called in another favor. U.S. Marshal Intel Group. I wanted names, patterns, digital trails. Within 48 hours, I had a report in my inbox that made my stomach turn. The Falcon Ridge HOA was running a shadow enforcement unit, a group of residents rotated weekly to monitor targeted properties. They used a WhatsApp thread to communicate, labeled Harmony Watch. They shared photos, license plates, and scheduled surveillance assignments. I had screenshots of them laughing about my clerks. One member suggested a little firework action to teach us a lesson. Another posted a doctored image of my face with the caption, Enemy of Order. It was surreal. These weren't criminals. They were accountants, realtors, retirees, playing a twisted game of suburban power. But they'd forgotten one thing: every message they sent, every threat they whispered, every citation they posted, they were building my case. I wasn't just documenting now. I was staging, trapping, structuring the narrative. That's when I ordered the signs. 3 of them, mounted in brass and embedded at the property edge. Private property, Monroe Estate, federal protected status. No trespassing. All entry recorded and reported under 18 U.S.C. Section 1382. It was a warning. A dare. And it worked. For a moment, everything went quiet. No new citations. No knocks. No sirens. Just stillness. I should have known that was the calm before the real storm. Because 1 week later, I received the package. A thick envelope. No return address. Inside were 4 notarized documents. Deed transfer agreements. Property reassessment forms. And a letter, Mr. Monroe, we are offering a final opportunity to resolve the ongoing dispute. Falcon Ridge Development Initiative is prepared to purchase your property for $1.4 million above assessed value. This offer is valid for 7 days. Should you decline, we will pursue all legal avenues to remove the encumbrances currently obstructing community unity. Choose wisely. I stared at the offer for a long time. Then I laughed. Because they had finally slipped. They'd put it in writing. They were trying to force me to sell by manufacturing conflict, tampering with utilities, spreading libel, and organizing a neighborhood surveillance ring. That wasn't just unethical. That was criminal racketeering. I scanned the offer, copied it into the dossier, and picked up the phone. Elliot, I said, scheduled the press conference. He whistled. Time to bring the walls down? No, I said. Time to bring the roof down. On all of them. Because they hadn't just harassed me. They'd broken the law. Repeatedly. Publicly. Documented. And the next move wasn't going to be another letter. It was going to be subpoenas, headlines, and federal hearings. They wanted to play HOA war games. I was about to turn this neighborhood into Exhibit A in a federal prosecution manual. Let's see how Edward Brackley likes the taste of his own medicine. In court. On record. Under oath. By the time the Falcon Ridge HOA realized the quiet in my corner of the neighborhood was the sound of something vast being loaded, aimed, and locked, it was already too late. The press conference took place at the Monroe Estate Library, the old East Wing my grandfather once used for judicial clerk meetings and late-night oral argument rehearsals. We cleared the long table, set out 6 chairs, and placed a modest wooden sign at the front door, Community Legal Briefing, Public Welcome. It was simple, respectful, unassuming. And it drew 47 people. Half of them were neighbors, some of them curious, others nervous. The rest? Reporters, municipal watchdogs, a zoning board official I recognized from a previous Supreme Court amicus filing, and one unmistakable face in the back corner, Charles Wren, a regional investigator for the State Attorney General's office. Elliot stood to my left, Rachel to my right, and me directly in front of the crowd, hands folded like a judge reading a sentencing. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice calm, even. "I'm not here to disrupt your neighborhood. I'm here to protect mine. Because the house I inherited sits on federally protected land, exempt from HOA jurisdiction. And yet I have been fined, harassed, threatened, and publicly defamed. And I'm not alone." I pulled out a binder. Not digital. Physical. Tactile. Intimidating in its thickness. These are 23 affidavits from residents of Falcon Ridge who were coerced into selling their homes under threat of escalating fines. Many of them elderly. Many of them sick. Many of them unaware the violations were fabricated. In some cases, the signatures on their sales documents don't match their legal records. A hush fell over the room. Even the reporters' pens paused. I wasn't done. These, I continued, holding up another folder, are utility complaints filed after water and power disruptions that coincide almost perfectly with documented disputes involving the HOA. In 5 cases, the same contractor handled the service. Silverback Municipal, a company partially owned by the Brackley family through a holding corporation registered in Nevada. I clicked a remote. The screen behind me changed. A chart appeared, built by Rachel, clean, lethal, annotated in red. HOA citations. Utility complaints. Deed transfers. Timestamps. Every line a thread in a noose. We believe this neighborhood's HOA is operating not as a community management organization but as a racketeering enterprise, extorting residents, weaponizing bylaws, and laundering control through family-owned companies and undisclosed LLCs. And as of this morning, I have filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney for this district, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Federal Trade Commission. Gasps. Real ones. Not the kind you see in movies. The real kind where people look at each other and wonder if they've been complicit without knowing it. I leaned forward. This is your neighborhood, but you're not in control of it. A man named Edward Brackley is. And he has been feeding you lies, siphoning your dues, and sacrificing your neighbors one by one to fund his real estate ambitions. I let the words hang there. The way my grandfather used to pause before delivering a final ruling. You deserve better. Then I stepped back. No dramatics. Just silence. Letting the weight of what I'd revealed settle into their bones. The first person to speak was an older man with liver spots on his scalp and a cane in his hand. "They forced me out of the board 3 years ago," he said, voice low but steady. "Said I was too soft. That I wasn't business-minded enough. I thought it was just politics. Now I know." The second voice was sharper. "My daughter got a violation for hanging a pride flag. Said it disrupted community harmony. I thought it was bigotry. Turns out it was business." Heads turned. Whispers grew. And then came the woman I'd been waiting on, Mrs. Barbara Leeds. Widow. Former treasurer. The woman who, weeks ago, refused to speak to me out of fear. Now she stood, her voice trembling but audible. "They forged my husband's name on 2 documents after he died," she said. "They threatened to sue me if I contested it. They told me I'd lose the house. That was the moment it broke. The illusion. The control. The fragile ecosystem of fear that Brackley and his cronies had crafted over the years shattered under the light of exposure. By the end of the meeting, 3 homeowners had offered to testify. 2 reporters had requested interviews. And Wren, the AG's investigator, gave me a small nod and quietly asked for my full file. I gave him 2 copies. One on a flash drive. The other printed, indexed, and bound. Just the way the court would like it. That night, the HOA sent out an emergency email blast. Defamatory misinformation is being spread by a recent arrival who has no understanding of Falcon Ridge values. Residents are advised to disregard any legal threats and continue cooperation with the HOA for the health of our community. I didn't respond. The next morning, I dropped a 42-page class action draft lawsuit on their porch. Not filed. Not yet. Just placed there. Like a prophecy. Elliot suggested it. "Let them know we're coming," he said, grinning. Let them feel the countdown. It worked. By noon, Brackley was pacing outside the community clubhouse, barking into his phone while neighbors filmed him from behind hedges. The footage went viral. "Is it true you faked liens?" one woman shouted. "What's Harmony Watch, Ed?" a teenager asked while holding a printout from the group chat screenshots I'd leaked anonymously. Brackley shouted something about libel, then stormed inside. He never came back out. That evening, the HOA vice president, Marla Jennings, resigned. Publicly. Posted a message in the community forum. I didn't know the full extent of what was happening. I regret not asking more questions. I encouraged the board to cooperate with investigators and urge residents to support a full audit. That's when it really started to turn. Signs began appearing on lawns: "Audit the HOA, Justice for Ruth," and "The Extortion." My mailbox, once stuffed with fines and threats, now held thank you notes. Cookies. One elderly neighbor left a sketch of my grandfather holding a gavel with the words, "He saved us once. You're saving us again." And that's when the mail stopped again. Only this time it wasn't the HOA. It was the state. A letter from the Attorney General's office. Investigation open. Subpoenas issued. Preliminary injunction being drafted. The HOA board was being summoned. And so was I. As a witness. A whistleblower. A complainant. I'd gone from being their target to becoming their reckoning. 1 week later, the HOA attempted a last-ditch effort to hold an emergency vote to expel me from the community. Irreparable harm to neighborhood peace, they claimed. Defamation of board members. They held it in the clubhouse. I walked in mid-meeting wearing a simple suit, holding a briefcase. The room fell silent. I didn't say a word. I just walked up to the projector, plugged in a USB, and hit play. Video footage from 2 months ago, Brackley instructing compliance officers to fabricate notices. Audio of a board member joking about the next Monroe lawsuit. Screenshots from Harmony Watch. The video ended. I said nothing. Just packed up my bag and walked out. The vote never happened. Brackley was removed from his post that Friday. He's currently under investigation. And the HOA? Gutted. Empty offices. Frozen bank accounts. Internal emails seized. I sat on the porch that evening, whiskey in hand, watching the sun dip below the ridge. The house was quiet. Still. Free. No sirens. No fake citations. No trespassers with phones. Just the wind, the porch swing, and the sound of victory. But I wasn't done. The lawsuit was coming next. And when it landed, it wouldn't just bury Falcon Ridge. It would send a message to every HOA in the country that forgot where their power ends and the law begins. My name is Monroe. And I don't lose to bullies. I dismantle them. Legally. Permanently. Publicly. The morning of the hearing, I wore the same Navy suit my grandfather was buried in. Not out of sentiment, but as a message. The man who once dismantled municipal corruption from the bench had passed his final case to someone with the same blood, the same fire, and a sharper pen. The courtroom was a cathedral of polished oak, sunlight spilling across marble as if even God wanted front row seats. And in the far left section, huddled like wilting churchgoers before a storm, sat the remains of the Falcon Ridge HOA board, Brackley included. He looked smaller now. His blazer didn't fit right. His hair was thinner, his confidence replaced with fidgety glances at an attorney who hadn't yet realized they were already losing. I sat opposite, Elliot beside me, Rachel in the gallery, and 24 residents from Falcon Ridge who now called me neighbor, friend, and for some liberator. But I didn't walk in that courtroom to win back peace. I walked in to annihilate an institution built on fraud and fear. The case was formally listed as Monroe versus Falcon Ridge HOA, but behind the name was a legal hydra of civil claims: violation of the Fair Housing Act, conspiracy to defraud, mail fraud, elder abuse, RICO predicates, abuse of process, and punitive damages. Every count had its own folder, color-coded, tabbed, cross-referenced with depositions and forensic audit trails. We had screenshots, bank ledgers, testimonies, and a digital archive of every HOA newsletter, citation, and falsified lien filed over the last decade. But more than that, we had the community behind us. 42 residents signed as co-complainants. 12 more filed supporting affidavits. 2 former board members turned state's witnesses after realizing immunity was their best offer in a burning house. And one of them, Marla Jennings, sat behind me now, her hands shaking as she clutched the statement she would soon read aloud. The judge took her seat. She was sharp, deliberate, and famously allergic to nonsense. I knew her reputation. She was the kind of jurist who issued rulings so cleanly worded they were quoted in academic textbooks. And today, I'd make sure Falcon Ridge became her next case study in judicial accountability. Brackley's attorney tried to open with a motion to dismiss. My clients are volunteers, he stammered, doing their civic duty under legal authority granted by the community charter. I stood before he could finish. Your Honor, I have a binder of that so-called charter with 3 forged amendments, 2 fabricated votes, and a clause that claims jurisdiction over properties it legally cannot touch under federal land preservation orders. This isn't a charter. It's a criminal enterprise's business plan. The judge raised one brow, then motioned him to sit. Denied. Proceed. We opened with the footage. Harmony watch. Compliance officers trespassing. Brackley instructing them to find something, anything. The courtroom was dead quiet except for the occasional throat clear and the click of a pen. Then came the financials. Elliot flipped through screens showing HOA funds transferred to Silverback Municipal Services, then funneled through a realty trust owned by Brackley's son. One of the jurors visibly clenched his fists. And then I said they'd file citations, impose fines, block utilities, and offer to buy your home at a discount. We have 14 such transactions. The most recent, Mrs. Ruth Granger, was extorted out of her home while on oxygen and her house was flipped for a $120,000 profit within 3 weeks. I pointed to Ruth, who sat in the back row clutching her daughter's hand. She paid into this community for 30 years. They repaid her with theft. Then came the turning point. We called Marla to the stand. She walked slowly, carefully, but when she spoke, her voice didn't waver. They told me to stop asking about the books, she said, and when I didn't, they replaced me with someone who would sign anything Brackley put in front of them. He called it streamlining compliance. I thought I was helping. I didn't know I was helping steal people's homes. Brackley buried his face in his hands. We followed with Olivia, my law clerk, who detailed the surveillance and threats, and the moment she found HOA keyed into her car. Her voice cracked. Someone in the gallery gasped. But I wasn't done. I called Charles Wren to the stand, the AG's investigator, and asked him to summarize the state's findings. We discovered misuse of funds, fabricated documents, and abuse of legal authority consistent with organized racketeering, he said plainly. In my career, I've taken down cartels less coordinated than this HOA. Brackley tried to pivot. He took the stand against his attorney's advice and gave a rehearsed speech about community, tradition, and misunderstood intentions. He mentioned his father founding the HOA. He claimed the bylaws evolved organically. And when asked about the fake citations, he stammered that maybe things were aggressive but never malicious. That's when I stepped up for cross. Mr. Brackley, I began, how many homes were purchased by Falcon Ridge Holdings in the last 5 years? He hesitated. I don't have that number. I smiled, calm and cold. That's interesting. Because I have it. 22. And 17 of those residents had disputes with the HOA before the sale. That's not proof of wrongdoing. No. But this is. I held up a printed email. An internal message from you to your board: if they don't pay, we'll make them miserable until they sell. The view from Monroe's hilltop would be a hell of a clubhouse. He froze. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Brackley, is this your email? He said nothing. Mr. Brackley? Finally, I don't recall sending that. I leaned in just slightly. Well, I do. Because it was forwarded by your own treasurer. Silence. By the time closing arguments arrived, there was nothing left to argue. I stood before the court, that old suit heavy on my shoulders, and said this was never about dues. This was about control. About power abused under the illusion of community. They use trust as a weapon and bylaws as a shield. And they forgot that the law isn't a fence, it's a sword. And some of us are trained to wield it. The judge returned a week later with the ruling. It was seismic. The HOA was found liable on all counts. Brackley was referred for criminal prosecution. A restitution fund was ordered for the affected residents, funded by the liquidation of the HOA's assets. The association itself was dissolved formally, permanently. Falcon Ridge was no longer under HOA rule. The press ran wild. Federal lawyer dismantles corrupt HOA in landmark case. Judge's grandson breaks suburban syndicate. HOA tyrant faces charges after residents' revenge. I didn't speak to them. I didn't need to. The law had spoken louder than I ever could. A month later, I stood outside with a cup of coffee watching as a work crew removed the faded Falcon Ridge HOA sign from the front gate. They cut it down in 2 sections, dropped it into a metal bin, and drove off without ceremony. I smiled. Olivia waved from her car. Ruth's daughter honked as she passed. Kids biked by on sidewalks no longer patrolled by citation-happy golf cart thugs. The neighborhood had changed. I walked up the hill, through the iron gate of the Monroe estate, past the restored garden and the porch where my grandfather used to read depositions under the sunset. I sat down in his chair, took a long sip of coffee, and closed my eyes. Justice isn't revenge. Justice is what happens when the right person is willing to go all the way so no one else has to. And in this neighborhood, that person had been me.